We need a minute taker and a jabber scribe. We cannot proceed without that. You'll be sitting here missing your flight. Anybody? No. Minute taker just take, and it's not recording dialogue. It's just like the main points, and you can say, look at Barnes's slides, and there's 80% of the job. Yes. Thank you, Dan. Okay, we need a jabber scribe, which is even easy. Yep, jabber.
Oh, no. I said go to someone. I don't want the laptop.
Ah, okay. Somebody who can be online and do the jabber? All right, thank you, Aaron.
Good morning, everybody. We are today, Friday, the last session of IETF 94. I don't know if anybody actually got to see it. The morning was actually visible, but that's Fujisan. And you are at ACME, where you do not have to scale Fujisan, despite it being the local ACME. We'll probably start the actual presentation in a few minutes. Given that it is Friday morning, we expect people to kind of trickle in a little bit. While we're waiting, we remind you to note well the IETF has an IPR policy which requires you to disclose any IPR of which you are personally aware. The details are in the noted RFCs, RFC 5378 and RFC 3979. Robin, do you have IPR you wish to declare?
No, I'm just kidding because I'm old.
Oh, okay. So we're at the note well section. The next bit is agenda bashing. So typically the administrivia includes finding the jabber scribe and the note takers. So thank you to our jabber scribe and note takers for having already put us ahead of schedule. Well done, you. Are there agenda bashes before we go into talking about our one and only working group draft? Does anybody feel the need to get up and talk about beer halls they went to last night, their experiences at the Scotch Pop? Nope. Okay, then Mr. Barnes, we invite you to the front and we will change presentations now.
Well, we'll see how this works. I made a nice JavaScript HTML-based presentation, and Ted's being a brute and making it be PDF instead. Yeah, I ran into this as I was running around yesterday. I think it's one of the sightseeing boat companies. And maybe the Japanese tells the answer. Hello.
That's better.
All right, so I guess let's keep going.
Hold the mic. Shoot during.
Hello. All right, so we are currently at version 0.1 of ACME. The chairs finally reminded me that I should submit 0.0 a little while back, which I did. I had held off submitting 0.0 because Andrew Eyre had pointed out the signature reuse vulnerability in the individual draft version, but went ahead and submitted it with this do not implement caveat at the front. So the major fix in the 0.0 to 0.1 transition was to fix that signature reuse vulnerability, which I think has been pretty thoroughly discussed on the list, so I won't recap it here. Peter Eckersley also pointed out some issues around default virtual hosts, which we'll discuss a little bit more a little later on in this deck. I put in some provisional fixes there. I think the fix for the HTTP-based challenges are probably good to go. We might revisit the TLS SNI-based fix a little later. let's see. Oh yeah, and at the end, even though this version fixes the signature reuse vulnerabilities, and I think is as good as we know how to make the protocol right now, I forgot to remove the do not implement caveat. This version 0.1 is what Let's Encrypt is currently using for the record, so there is some deployment out there. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so just to, I guess I will recap the signature reuse issue. So the fix to the signature reuse issue was, well, what Andrew pointed out was that the way we were using signatures in the challenges we had defined relied on using the fact that someone could generate a specific signature value as proof that they had a certain public key. And what Andrew pointed out was that you could craft, given a signature value that had been provisioned by the real domain owner, in some cases you could craft a key pair that would produce that signature value. So to avoid relying on that property of signature systems, which is not a common property, we refactored things not to use signatures at all, but instead just to provide directly the token from the challenge and a digest of the account key that's being authorized. Remembering that challenges are the way the owner of a domain expresses his authorization for an account key to act for that domain in ACME. So one of the nice things about that was that we now have a lot of consistency in how the challenges are expressed. So that token.thumbprint thing is now a standard construct that is used in HTTP-based validation, SNI-based validation, and DNS-based validation. The latter two cases have some compactness requirements, so instead of using that thing directly, we use the digest of it, but it's either the thing itself or a digest of the thing, the same in all three cases. Nice little bit of consistency there. Next slide, please. Default vhost thing, the issue there was that in some server deployment environments, if you've got a bunch of virtual hosts behind a TLS server, and someone sends you a client hello that has an SNI field that you don't recognize, these hosting environments will send that client hello to some default vhost they have configured. And the upshot of that is that if a domain is hosted in one of those environments, then that default vhost can use the SNI-based validation or the HTTP-based validation using TLS to get a certificate for any other host on that vhost. So that seemed like kind of a bad thing. Well, yeah, so to try and work around that, the change we made in 0.1 was to remove the TLS option from HTTP validation because there are default vhosts in some cases with vanilla HTTP, but it's much less common because you always send the host header. So you tend not to have as much of a need for that. So HTTP validation is now really only HTTP validation, not HTTP or HTTPS validation. Figured that it was pretty safe to remove that. If we wanted to do an HTTPS-based one in the future, we could just add an HTTPS challenge. In the TLS SNI validation case, the solution that Eckersley proposed was to, instead of doing a single round of challenging the client to provision a random looking SNI on the server and provision a cert that corresponds to that, let's generate a sequence of several random looking values and require the server to respond for some random subset of that chosen by the server. Yeah, I see the face Aaron is making. Yeah, it's complicated and a big dance. And it's been there's a PR right now proposing that we revert this change. So keep that in mind as we roll forward. Next slide, please. All right, so that was all the major changes in the transition to 0.1. Since then, this week, I went through and merged a bunch of trivial editorial PRs, and including fixing the do not implement caveat, so now it's officially implement, as Ted said. I kept a little bit of a caveat at the top. I cribbed some text from TLS 1.3, which has a nice little disclaimer at the top. Says this is still a work in process. There may be more security analysis, so if you deploy, be careful. and added a pointer to the GitHub repo at the top of the document as well. Next, please. That's just a list of the things we merged. They're all little things, getting rid of the simple and simple HTTP because we don't like simplicity. All right, so today I think the plan was just to go through the issues and pull requests. I went through all the issues and PRs in the GitHub repo, and we have slides on that, turn them into slides, and I've got some suggested resolutions for them and some points I'd like to get some feedback on. Next slide. So yeah, so hopefully we can end up with some extra security at the end of the day. All right, so I'm trying to make this roughly in increasing order of difficulty, so we can take more and more time on these issues as we go through them. This one I thought was pretty straightforward. Someone proposed we add a domain to the when we do a TLS SNI validation. Currently, we just have challenge1.challenge2.acme.invalid as the server name that's presented to the TLS server. What that means is when that name comes in, if you haven't configured the server a priori to know where to send this, the server has no idea where to send it because it's just a bunch of random junk.acme.invalid. So the proposal was that we could put the domain in the middle there to provide a hint to the server as to where the server should route this client hello. But on the other hand, this is not something that any stack currently does, and you can imagine if domain gets close to that 255 octet limit, you would have to rejigger the name somehow to make it fit. Yeah, Ted.
Yeah, basically I was going to say I'm certainly aware of host strings that would be very interested in using ACME that are close to the byte limit because they're relatively deep hierarchies. People are interested in using this in enterprise contexts where it would be hostname.location.corp.enterprise name.top level domain, and if you start having two challenges in front of that, and ACME and invalid, it's going to blow up. So I think the 255 byte limit really writes this out.
Yep. All right. Does anyone think this is an important failsafe? Because if not, I'm just going to close the issue. Won't fix. All right. So be it. All right. Good. Easy one. Killed it. Second one. This one is a little bit subtle. So this started out as a proposal to add a PR that adds a specific error to the table of errors, which will ultimately be in an IANA registry. And so it raises the question of what should we do about error extensibility? Chances are, as we develop this and we get some implementation experience, we'll want to flesh out the error registry to provide more detailed semantics. And the question is, how should we manage this? Right now, there's a requirement. Right now, let's see, we have a specification that we've defined the earn ACME namespace, and there's a proposal in the PR that we require servers not to emit errors in that namespace unless they're defined. So the requirement would be, your server is non-compliant if it's emitting errors that are earn ACME and they're not registered errors. So a client can then use that earn ACME namespace as an indication that it's getting something that's likely to understand.
So I think it depends on what kind of registry control you want, right? If you're going to do like an expert review or specification required, you might as well keep it in the URN ACME namespace because it doesn't matter, right? If you're going to be a first come first serve or a very sort of just spam control, then you just let people use whatever URIs they want.
Yeah, this kind of reminded me of the X- header debate. We could define some extension namespace where people could drop things. To be honest, the earn thing is kind of an artifact of our reuse of the problem document format. So maybe we can just let 1,000 errors bloom, so to speak. And just let people shove whatever they want, shove whatever token they want after earn ACME. But Ted seems like he might have an opinion about that.
Ted Hardy, again, I don't think it's a problem to have non-URN ACME namespace error messages, but I did want to suggest that we actually pull out the registration of the URN into a different document so that we can progress that quickly and get it set, because the process for getting a URN NID is a bit of arcana. I've dealt with a couple of different times, and it is not quick arcana at the moment because there's a URN BIS working group going. I apologize. I was so excited about URNs, I turned off the mic. For those of you playing the home game, what I said was the URNs are a bit of arcana I've dealt with in the past, and it can be a bit slow. So I propose that we actually pull out this registration and do it separately from progressing the document so we can do it in advance. Anybody have a problem with that proposal?
Ted, do you want to see if anyone here or on the list wants to volunteer to do that document? Or do you want to just?
So if there's anybody else who's deeply in URN arcana who would like to take on the document, I'm happy to. Oh, Melinda, hi. So she just stepped down as co-chair. So this is arcana. She does not. This is dark arcana to her. She does not wish to touch it. So the chairs will find some Stucky, possibly one of the chairs.
Let you know something. I think extensibility for errors is kind of dangerous. It's actually very hard for a lot, a wide range of clients to sort of agree on common semantics for errors. So what I would suggest is that have IANA registry for URN ACME, have specification required for those, and then but allow other URIs. So if you want to have your own local thing, right? Don't expect anybody else to understand it.
So what namespace would you propose we put those, you do your own thing?
No, you just let people stick whatever URIs they want, right?
Okay.
Don't have the protocol enforce URNs. Just let people use whatever URIs they want, right? But the things that you expect all clients, the semantics I expect all clients to understand. So have that in URN ACME and have specification required for it.
So does that argue in favor of this requirement on the slide? If you're going to emit something URN ACME, you need to use one of the registered values and not something you just made up. If you're going to use something you just made up, don't put it in that namespace.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So you, Melinda, I think you're.
Yeah, just a quick comment that actually, I'm not that optimistic about URN BIS getting the BIS document out, but there is an interest in expediting getting namespaces registered. So, right, so that might be fine. I don't think that the URNs themselves need to be overly complex here. I think it could be pretty straightforward. So I don't see the logistical side of this as a problem. And actually, I don't see the semantic side of it as a problem either. So.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I was wondering why you chose URN ACME rather than just look at being a subject to one of the existing URN IETF or whatever is used elsewhere. I did. Sorry. So we have URN something, IETF something in a number of other places, and registering things in that space has proven to be relatively straightforward. There's a BCP on it, and I've done it before. It was just a matter of writing an RFC, and then I acted upon that. So if people are scared about creating a new top-level URN identifier, then we have another option available to us.
But so I'm going to put myself virtually on the floor for a second. I still think it would be a good idea to pull it out into a separate document, whether we are going to put it in an existing namespace or construct a new one, depending on whether or not we want people to be able to register things into this namespace with specifications outside of the IETF, which is a question we would deal with in that document. We might make either choice, but I'm fine with it being in an existing namespace if the registry rules for that namespace match the semantics we want.
Sure. So the other thing that I was going to suggest here is that we seem to be discussing things that relate to the problem draft that is in apps area working group, apparently. So rather than try to prescribe what goes in that particular field here, maybe we should just leave that to the apps area working group to define how you fill that particular field. And they have rules, I think, you'll find, and we can just follow those rules. I don't see that there's any need for us to prescribe further than that. I mean, if you see some random junk in there, then it's not going to be particularly useful to you. You may not be able to act upon it, but same applies if the server just returns a 503 with no problem. So I don't see this as a particular problem for us to solve.
Yeah, if you have suggestions on other places, we might, other, or URN constructs we might use, nail to the list would be helpful. Another point that occurs to me as we're talking about URNs is that we might want to not put the errors directly under whatever namespace we define, but instead define some error space within it in case we want to name other things. Okay, so I think that net of all that discussion, few action items came out of that, but I think the proximate question is, I think we should go ahead and make this requirement that if you're going to use whatever namespace we define, then use the values we define. And if you're going to use something else, use something else. Now, seeing nodding heads, thumbs up. And Thompson to the mic.
Yeah, RFC 3553. Just read it. You'll probably find something that
Can you summarize which one is that?
The title is an IETF URN sub-namespace for registered protocol parameters.
Thank you.
Okay, minutes capture that. Thanks. All right, so good. I'll get Jacob to update that PR, and we should be able to land that pretty quickly. Next, please. So yeah, here the proposal was to use an extension for the paths we have in simple HTTP. So recall that simple HTTP, now called HTTP-01. In this challenge, the client proves his ownership of a domain by provisioning a file on an HTTP server. Right now, the process that the server follows to verify that challenge requires that the content type that returns in the HTTP response be either text plain or nothing. Now, when you're building a stack to fulfill these challenges, this raises the question of how do I get my HTTP server to emit the correct thing? Those of us who know how to configure HTTP servers, and there are a variety of ways to do this, but one of the simpler ways is just to put .txt at the end. However, the structure of the URL is defined by ACME, and it says don't put txt at the end. My inclination here is to just skirt the question of content types entirely. I'm not sure. I think I may have put the wrong proposal here. Different proposal. Proposed, just ignore the content type. Thumbs up from Thompson. Anyone think that it's important for the server to check the content type when checking the response from the server that purports to prove ownership of a domain? Ted.
Ted Hardy, a question about that. One of the things text plain gives you is the ability to decorate it with what you're expecting the character set to be, right? There are some other things you can decorate it with, but are we specifying at this stage that the content have a specific encoding, and is there a risk that if the default encoding of the HTTP server doesn't match that you would need this in order to make sure that the encoding that's read by ACME is the encoding that ACME will then match?
Is there a default encoding for text plain? UTF-8?
Yes, it is ASCII.
ASCII. I'm sorry? Yeah, okay. And in fact, all the characters we would be putting in this thing are all ASCII characters.
Okay, so it would only be the case that somebody who was running an HTTP server whose content system had a different default encoding that might run into this issue. And as long as they were doing anything in the UTF-8 space, all of the ASCII fields are the same. So it seems like a corner case, but maybe we want to point out that corner case if we adopt the do no content type. That if your content system and does not use ASCII, you need to make sure that this particular content turns into ASCII when you're meeting the ACME test.
Yeah, when I said, I should have been slightly clearer. I said ignore the content type. I really meant don't require the content type to have a particular value. I think we can still let the server use information in the content type header to properly interpret the contents of the body.
So I think at that point, you probably want to specify not just that it's text plain, but what character set you're expecting. And so if you want it to be the default character set, ASCII, then you say, you may include the character set information as a decoration to the text plain, or you may omit it, since that it is the default. But if you include something else, like if you give us a car set that's, JP-232 or something, it will fail, right? Now the question you run into there is, because ASCII is a strict subset of UTF-8, if somebody gives you a car set and says it's UTF-8, what do you expect to happen?
Right.
And a suggestion from Dr. Thompson.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, I'm going to recommend that we specify that a particular encoding is used, a very specific encoding is used, which is that you're doing the base 64 thing, right? To produce the string. Yeah, and then you do a UTF-8 thing or an ASCII thing, which are equivalent in this case, and the server retrieves the resource, ignores the content type, and does some amount of matching, and maybe we can allow for an end-of-line character or white space in there, but you actually specify what octets are matched up.
I was leaning in that way as well, to just fix the serialization in bytes and say the payload you return me must be the UTF-8 encoding, because I think that in practice, the way people are going to implement the validation algorithm, you're probably going to run into issues if you try to use a different character set anyway.
Ted Hardigan, I would agree with you that if you try and use a different set of characters, especially with text plain, the chances of you getting it right and validating are pretty slim. So if you do it as a serialization of bytes and UTF-8, I think my implication here is that I disagree with Martin and that we should not allow white space, because that simplifies your life enormously. And simply do it as a serialization of bytes, no white space, no end of line. Okay.
Exactly the string. Yep, that makes sense to me. All right, so yeah, resolved there. We will update the challenge to not have a requirement on the content type and to be strict about what is sent. DKG?
This is DKG. I agree with you that it seems really nice to say we're not going to allow white space, but I know lots of server administrators who don't know the difference between a file that has a new line at the end and doesn't. And if their thing is failing because the string XYZ doesn't match the string XYZ, they're going to be pretty confused.
Perhaps we say white space is ignored. So
well, this is the argument here, right?
But
I mean, string.trim is allowed. The server may string.trim.
Right.
Ted, what do you think? You look sad.
Ted Hardy, actually, I was about to say something a little less cryptic, but exactly the same effect. That if you do a prefix match here, or essentially permit white space only at the end of the matching octets, then I think you get both properties. And I think if somebody is a server administrator and they see XY carriage return Z.2 and it doesn't match XYZ.2, they'll recognize it. Or if there's XY blank space Z.2 and it doesn't match XYZ.2, they'll recognize it. It's really only this case of the termination characters. And so I think that Martin's suggestion of prefix match or permitting white space only at the end is probably the best compromise.
Yeah, I think you want the latter of the two things you said, which is to only allow white space at the end. I think if you just said prefix match, I would have worries about trailing semantic characters.
Well, so you could you could basically, yeah, okay. So white space permitted only at the end is actually probably the characteristic you want, because you could have a prefix match where there were garbage characters that were not white space and it would still match the prefix, and that's probably
That seems
undesirable.
likely to be risky.
White space permitted only at the end. Ooh, this is always fun to write the A, B, and F for.
Yeah. I don't think there's any A, B, and F in the document.
Yeah. Martin Thompson.
Anywhere.
I think that's a perfectly acceptable outcome. I mean, you could put arbitrary amounts of junk at the end as well, and have some level of confidence that the person had put that information there. But I see no reason to allow for the valid token plus someone's essay or something like that. That suggests that there might be some way that someone could squeeze that in at the start of a document that. I don't know. I can't imagine an attack here, but let's try to be as strict as we possibly can without getting ourselves trapped. I'm tempted to reduce it even further than white space at the end to simply carriage return line feed at the end, because those are the only things that tend to get dropped into the end of.
Actually, space and tab do all the time as well.
Space and tab do all the time. I'm thinking about serving infrastructure only, and editors that drop line feed, carriage return line feed at the end of a text file when you save them, those sorts of things. But yeah, you're right. I can tolerate space too.
DKG, I'm fine with this. Please do tolerate space as well, just for the sake of the error message that says XYZ doesn't match XYZ.
All right, so we will allow spaces at the end of our bike shed. All right, great. So that sounds like we've got a resolution there. Okay, one request I got that is there's an issue for us to support key rollover for account keys. So right now we have this notion of registration. When a client first shows up, he registers his contact information and signs that with an account key pair. And then forevermore, that account key pair represents the registration. And so when a client shows up and says, give me an authorization, the key that's used to sign that request for authorization is the thing that identifies which client that came from, identifies which registration, which account that came from. As it stands right now, there's the only time you can set the account key is when you create the registration. So de facto, you have one account key forever once you created a registration. And you can imagine clients having a long-term relationship with the CA, having the same account for a long time, and they might be concerned about the stability of that key, the possible compromise of an account key, and so they might want to rotate their account keys every so often. So the proposal here, well, first proposals, I think this seems like a reasonable thing to implement. Anyone think this is not a good idea? This is too much overhead? Okay, so, Ted.
Ted, kind of a clarifying question. I don't have like serious agita about it, but I thought the theory here was that in a situation like this, a client created a new account and got credentials for the same servers on the new account using challenges, and could thereby eliminate the old account once the new account had appropriate credentials. Now, the difference between that and this is really now you need a mechanism to destroy an account as opposed to a mechanism to roll over an account. It becomes functionally how you do the key rollover.
Well, the other difference is, okay.
The reason you might prefer it that way, as far as I can tell, is it also means that you're using the same mechanism for loss of credential that you're using for key rollover, right? Because whatever proof I gave you to say, hey, I've lost my private key, and therefore I need to create a new account to manage these same domains. And the mechanism you use when you want to just create a new one is parallel, and that just seems simpler. And I'm wondering if there's a gotcha there I'm not seeing.
JC?
JC Jones, Let's Encrypt. The reason we in particular would want to keep to roll over an account key is because In practice, we have special relationships with certain subscribers, and it's a configuration problem to have to move all of that information from one opaque public key to another. It would be nice to be able to do this in an API fashion.
Tetra, just for you then, but you're okay then with having two mechanisms where you'll also have to have the credential loss mechanism for people with whom you don't have a special relationship, where they generate a new account, right?
I think we would be fine with that. It would just, I could imagine other ways that we could do that. I could imagine other ways we could do this, keeping the one. I would like to have the ability to track one person beyond, or one organization beyond just a public key that changes.
And it also seems like, you know, we do have recovery mechanisms in the draft right now, and they're pretty darn heavyweight because you don't have the original account key. So you have to go through some giant complicated dance to prove you're the original guy. It seems plausible, since given that we have two mechanisms already, to have a third that's sort of the orderly way to do it, when you haven't lost the original account key, so you can prove you're the original guy.
Tetra, okay, I guess the mechanism that you certainly propose here seems like, if you're going to support this, this would be the simplest way to do it.
Robin Wilton, whether you end up with one mechanism or two, I'd encourage you to think very carefully about both of them in terms of ACID transaction properties, because from a user experience point of view, I've a few times got stuck in that nightmare loop where you've told the service provider that you've lost the password, or you want to you reset the password and or delete the account, and everything gets horribly snarled up, and then you can't do either. So it is tough, and if you end up needing to do that multiple times, it's probably tougher than having to do it fewer times.
Yeah, I mean, so if you've got comments, we've got the recovery mechanisms, the I lost my account key mechanisms in there right now. So if you got any thoughts on there, I'd be glad to have them. So I think I've got a sketch of this in the next slide. Yeah, so the proposed, this is just sort of a notional construct to use something like, to do a post to the registration endpoint, the same way you would do to update your email address, or the contact information that's associated with your account. And in that, to put either a key or a new key field that has a JWK that signs with the new key over some information that characterizes the existing account. So you would want to use that resource thing, as we do in the other messages, to ensure uniqueness, and have the registration field to indicate that the new key agrees to be bound onto this account. So that goes into the overall message, which gets signed with the old key, so that you get this, you get clearer authorization from the old key to the new key, and you get the new key assenting to be bound into this. Does this look roughly acceptable to folks if we're going to have this mechanism? Seeing slightly confused faces, but no violent reactions. Martin is making a face, shrugging. Okay, I will try and sketch this out in a little more detail and make a pull request and get some feedback on the list. Next issue. Yeah, so raise your hand if you've heard of certificate transparency. Yeah, so certificate transparency, the operative part of it right now are these things called signed certificate timestamps, which is how a web server proves to a browser, or a certificate subject proves to a relying party, to take my browser hat off, that the certificate he's presenting was logged in CT. And CT defines a couple of ways to provide this. You can put an extension in the cert, you can use an OCSP extension, or you can, the server can provide the SCT and a TLS extension and a TLS handshake it's doing. And especially in that third case, the first two cases, the CA just provides them in the CERT or an OCSP. In that third case with the TLS extension, the client, the web server, might want to is going to need to download the SCT somehow so that it can then stick it in its TLS server config to send out in that TLS extension. So I think Erica Scorla filed an issue here to propose adding some way in ACME to tell the CERT subject where he can download an SCT that goes with this CERT. Proposal here is pretty simple. Just add a link header from the certificate resource pointing to the SCT so that as you're configuring your CERT into your web server, you can just follow that link and get the information, much like we link to the parent certificates right now. Yeah, Linus.
I'm Linus Norberg from Nordinet. As an SCT is only a promise of future inclusion, would it be possible for you to also get the actual proof of inclusion and made it possible for people to actually download that as well?
Yes, this is a conversation I keep having with the CT people about, once the thing's included, can't we just use the log proofs? The challenge with that is that the log inclusion proofs are relative to a specific tree head, and that's going to change over time.
That's correct, but there's another proof that anyone can get from the log, that is the consistency proof from that particular tree head to any tree head. And the difference between this is that the former inclusion proof is potentially privacy problematic because it points to a specific certificate. Then again, if you're already getting the certificate, you're already in that position that you are divulging what you're interested in. And maybe this is not an interesting case because you are the domain, but just as it's not extremely complicated to get that. And if we get a need for it tomorrow, the SCT is only half of the thing. So basically, if you could, it might be interesting. I'm not.
Do you know if there's a defined format for those log inclusion proofs right now? That would make it easier, obviously.
It is. I mean, there are two API, or there are two HTTP endpoints at the log that returns inclusion proofs and consistency proofs. They're basically a string of SHA-256.
Okay. I would actually probably still be inclined to publish SCTs like this just because that's what people are using today. It's what Chrome is checking for EV certificates. I guess they're checking for DV but not requiring. So I think I'd be inclined to publish SCTs in this way, but it might also be a good idea to publish log proofs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and feel free to file an issue or a PR to propose that. Thanks.
So if CT is successful, there'll be more than one log. So this should be, you should accommodate providing more than one of these.
Yeah, you can provide multiple link headers.
So this is DKG. I'm just, it seems like you ought to be able to provide multiple types of link headers too, in order to resolve the inclusion proof versus SCT question.
Absolutely, yeah, cool. Yeah, that's what the rel equals indicates what the thing is. It's that link. So right now we have rel equals up to point to the issuing CA certificate. So you can auto configure a chain in your server. So yeah, where we're just sort of accumulating links at the top of the certificate resource. So we would have an uplink for the parent. We'd have an SCT link for the SCT. We might have a login, or we might have 4 SCT links. We might have a log inclusion proof or 2 or 3. So yeah, the link is nice and flexible, so we can just shove all that stuff in there and provide metadata about a cert. Okay, so this should be pretty straightforward to implement. Got a long plane ride home to do some writing. Yeah.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. I'd just caution that if there isn't anything that's stable for the log inclusion proof, that you don't want to sort of make yourself subject to any vagaries of the process on that end of things. This is something that can be added later relatively easily, and only use things that you know are pretty stable in this regard. I think that we want to get this done as quickly as possible without having to wait for someone to do some arbitrary amount of work somewhere else to get the log inclusion proofs right.
Yeah, and this is clearly going to be optional anyway because there's not that many CAs doing CT for SSL certs right now anyway, except for EV. Okay, so I think we're closed on that one. Next. HTTP 01 protocol. So yeah, this is one issue in GitHub, but it's actually sort of three. One is pretty editorial. Yeah, just clarifying base64 URL. Actually, all of these are kind of editorial. One issue we've run into in implementation is actually one that's foreseen by the JWK spec. So we have this key authorization construct where we compute the thumbprint of a JWK. And obviously, in order for that to be a faithful representation, you need to have the same octet string representing the elements of the key. And in a lot of libraries, when you ask for the octet string for RSA keys, when you ask for the octet string representing the modulus n, it will helpfully prepend a 0 to it to make really clear that this is a positive integer and not a negative one. And that handily in the JWK spec, there's a note that says, if there is a 0 octet there, you must get rid of it. And so we actually ran into this bug in some interoperability testing around Let's Encrypt, where someone building a client was throwing in that 0 octet. And so I think the only action here is just to, again, clarify, point, hey, JWK says get rid of the 0 octet, and to make that clarification here. And it's sort of in a similar vein, because this computation of the JWK thumbprint and the key authorization is a little tricky. We'll add an example of how that computation goes, how you get from the numerical values of the key of an RSA key to the JWK to the thumbprint to the key authorization object. I think this one is looking more editorial than I imagined it when I wrote it down. Any objections to adding those clarifications? I think this is just text. Yeah. All right, next. That was easy. Yeah, that was just summary. Keep going. This one's actually kind of interesting. So there's an issue now to enable clients to request a certificate lifetime. I believe some issuance systems today have this property where a client can send a request and say, give me a 3-month cert, give me a 1-year cert, give me a 2-year cert, give me a 20-year cert. So that, to meet various demands, you might have a cloud hosting thing that is going to go away in a week, so you only want a week-long cert for it. Seems like a nice way to let clients opt in to shorter lifetimes as well, if that's something that CA desires. So the question arises of how we should express this. Seems pretty clear it should go in the new certificate message, because you're requesting a new certificate, you should specify its lifetime. And right now, all we have in the new certificate message is a certificate signing request, a CSR. There'd been some discussion of whether we should use CSRs or whether we should use JSON to describe the contents of the certificate. And I think where we ended up on the list was that we would use CSRs for things you can put in a CSR. The CSR syntax limits you to certain things, and things that need to be signed by the key pair. So to avoid things like triple handshake, unknown key share attacks, you need the key in the certificate to sign over the names that are going to be in the certificate. And so the names clearly need to be in there. They need to be signed by the key pair that you're certifying. So the question is, and then JSON we can use for other stuff that don't meet those first two criteria. So the question is, how should we express this? Oh, in the next slide, please. Oh, this blinks in the HTML version. We don't get the blink here, we just get the red. Yay. Yeah, so I pulled up the definition of CSRs just to double check that there was no validity period here. And in fact, RFC 2986 explicitly says it does not include a validity period because they're optimizing for short requests to accommodate certificate authorities that are accepting requests on paper. I'm so glad we accommodate that use case. So double check, we cannot put the validity period in the CSR. So next slide. Proposed to just add some fields. That's the standard solution here. Obviously you can imagine doing this in the standard 2 ways of representing a date range. Either you could have the client say what duration it wants out of the certificate, or it could specify not before and not after dates. The duration seems appealing in some ways because the CA is going to assign the not before, not after dates anyway. It's probably not just going to accept what the client hands it. But on the other hand, I don't think there's a standard way of expressing durations in a string or in JSON, whereas for dates, we have the standard 3988, I think it's the, or whatever the ISO number date syntax is. Thank you. ISO 8601, not RFC 8601, we're not there yet. Any thoughts on dates versus duration? Rich?
Hi, Rich Sauls, no hats. I actually flip a coin as far as I'm concerned. Ted, I think may have a different opinion. Is the intent that the Acme server errors if it can't meet those dates, or does whatever it wants to do and the client has to look?
Yeah, I think there's always this idea that a new certificate request is a request by the client for some certain contents in the certificate, and the CSR can already include requests for extensions and things like that. You could require the poison extension from CT or something if you want an invalid certificate. And the CA can always choose not to fulfill that. Most obviously, if this client sends a CSR that's got some names it's not authorized for, so the CA needs to say, no, I will not serve that request. The CA also, in principle, has the option of changing the values and issuing a cert that is more to its liking. So yeah, I think the expectation would be that if the CA got some dates it didn't like, it would either clamp the dates to some range it liked or reject the request. I think that would be up to the CA.
So that's fine. I would just, the spec should say explicitly, because you would expect if you're asking for SANs to which you're not entitled, you would expect that to be rejected. And also those other things tend to be in the CSR, whereas this is outside of the CSR and has got, pick the behavior and just make sure it's documented. That's
could you maybe file an issue for clarifying when the server should hard fail versus accommodate? Because we're really hand wavy about that. Yeah, if you file an issue for that. Yeah, Melinda or Robin.
Yeah, just a quick point, but ISO 8601 does support durations, right? So.
Oh, is that right? I did not know that.
I mean, I don't
Martin,
like
please take that to the mic.
Yeah.
Let the minutes reflect.
Robin Wilson. Duration seems to me to open the door to far more ambiguity. I mean, if you're talking about months, culturally, some calendars work by lunar months and others don't, and some months are at different lengths. So if I say 6 months, do I mean starting at day one or starting now? Whereas the date thing, while it still has some cultural ambiguity, has less.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, yeah, 8601 defines a period format. Don't use that. It addresses all of the issues that Robin raised, but it is massively complex. The only reason that you would want to put a duration in here is if a human were generating this, and I think that to all intents and purposes, that's impossible for this sort of protocol. So I would suggest that what you have is perfectly fine.
So you're saying, if you want to expose the 90-day semantic or whatever to a client, the client software could generate the dates.
Yeah, you will configure the client with a duration in however the client decides to communicate with the user, but ultimately it will be dates in the certificate, and this makes it very, very unambiguous.
Cool. Long my client for this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just saying this is, I'm sorry? No, I think days are pretty clear as durations. I don't like durations. I'm just trying to be complete. But yeah, I think they are ambiguous. I don't like them. They're confusing for the reader. I mean, we've all seen on Facebook and Twitter, posted 3 hours ago, like, what does that mean, right? So and you run the risk of the same thing here, but it is technically feasible.
So this Russ Housley, I worry about including both in your actual semantics, because your example, for example, 90 days and 100 years. 100 years plus 90 days, who cares? if you, so you end up specifying all that, what do you do when they don't match stuff?
Sorry, Russ, what do you mean?
Your example has meaning that they don't match.
Correct. Your 2116.
Well, no, this is but that was a deliberate change actually to highlight that the CA has to be willing, has to check these and be willing to reject.
But my point is, we don't make the request be able to include inconsistent requests.
I'm sorry, in what way is this inconsistent?
The before after is 100 years. The duration is 90 days.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm sorry. This is, yes, I was not proposing that we have both of these. I was proposing we do one or the other and just put them both in there for illustrative purposes. Sorry if that was unclear.
JC Jones, I also agree that having an explicit date is probably better. Though if you are going to do duration, hours might be more precise for for short certificates. One other point on the explicit dates. In practice, we're seeing a non-trivial number of clients with extreme date skew. So we should probably be clear about what happens when the CA rejects in that case, perhaps a different error message.
Ted Hardy, I certainly agree a different error message would be a good thing. I think that what Martin said earlier about don't use this because they handle all of these issues and it's too complicated is perfect illustration of why we don't want duration, right? Anything we do that handles this correctly is going to be just as complicated. And, you know, given that I can construct durations in which days are ambiguous, I can construct hours that are ambiguous during time changes. You just don't want to go there. You got dates in the actual certificate. Let's not expose any other semantic.
Mike Jenkins, NSA. This is kind of a caveat, I guess. So how long the subscriber wants his certificate to last is not actually what these are about. This is an assertion by the CA that the replying party should not trust the certificate before and after these dates. Now, if you want to change what they mean, that you could do that, but I would suggest putting a lot of text around it.
Well, to be clear though, the objective of what we're proposing here is to allow the client to ask the CA to make a specific assertion of that.
Right, but if a CA says, I issue DV certs, and then CAB Forum which defines DV certs, has a certificate policy that says DV certs are good for whatever. I mean, so shortening it would certainly.
Yeah, CAB Forum only has a maximum.
So you already addressed it. You said the CA would check and make sure it was okay, but a CA may not. An arbitrary CA may not be thinking, I need to check these dates, and may not know what to do with them. So you might want to put some text in to explain what you're doing.
Yeah, and of course, as I said before, the CA is free to ignore whatever's in here and fill in whatever it likes.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, free to ignore, or if it can't provide, so there's a number of ways you could cut this, right? And
so we have
that's in the bug I just asked Rich to file.
There'll be an issue that says we need to clarify.
yeah, I would prefer that if the CA intended to extend the duration or had a minimum duration on the certificates it was providing, and the client asks for 30 seconds, which might be an unreasonable thing to ask for, that we have an error code for it. And I think Rich is right to ask that, yeah.
Max Paula. There's another option here to have a not before to specify I want the certificate from this date on and specify a duration that may be easier for a CA to check against their policies.
So actually, I was going to propose. I think that's not going to work for the reason that it includes the word duration, which I think we've established we don't want to touch. What I was going to ask is whether people think we need the not before date here, or if the client could just specify not after on the assumption that the CA would set not before to whenever it issues the certificate. Deb.
So, Deb Cooley, NSA. So the other side advantage to leaving the not before in is if you do have a case where you've got clock skew and the client really doesn't want that cert to be good before a particular time, he can say that to you.
All right, great. Yeah, I was just trying to optimize.
And forward issuance is a useful thing in operational.
Yep. Okay. Great. All right. So let it be known. We will use not before and not after, and not this wacky duration construct or any other. Great. Next issue. Simplify TLS-SNI challenge. So yeah, as I said before, to address the default vhost thing, we version 0.1 added this complicated dance where you generate a whole sequence of hashes from the initial value, and you're supposed to be able to respond for any of them, and the server tries some random subset of its choice. This is the proposal here is just to remove that and live with the risk. Yeah, Deb.
So my apologies, back on the last issue.
Yeah.
Are you going to sign that? Is the client going to sign that
Yes.
request?
Yeah,
Okay.
this request is signed with the client's account key.
Okay. Yay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the overall authorization. Every request the client sends to the server is signed with its account key. That's how we maintain continuity of identification of the client. Yeah. So yeah, the proposal here is that Jacob Hoffman Andrews from EFF proposed that we just do this. We revert out the fix to the TLS-SNI. His assertion is that there's a lot of work to do this. It makes the challenge really complicated to do, both for the client and the server. And in order to exploit this vulnerability requires kind of a corner case looking situation. You have to have this default, a hosting provider that has this default vhost issue, and you have to have the property that the attacker can provide a certificate for that, and can specify the certificate that is going to be provided for that default vhost. So the question here is, are we willing to live with that risk in order to save the save the hassle of going through this additional complexity in the TLS-SNI challenge? And of course, a CA could always just not offer this challenge if it's not willing to deal with that risk.
Tetrardy, two questions. I guess the first is, do we have any kind of empirical sense of how often this vhost configuration actually occurs in the wild?
I don't off the top of my head. I think Eckersley looked around a bit and found that he identified some software stacks that had the property. I don't know if he identified how often those configurations are used in deployed reality.
And in that case, it seems like if a software stack has been deployed with this vulnerability and a particular host is using it, or a particular hosting provider is using it, the hosting provider at that point can always generate one of these things in order to create certs for any of the hosts that they're hosting, right? Without necessarily creating anything that would be logged on the host they're hosting itself. So you could say, hey, it's the hosting provider. They could always attack you, right? And they could attack you by creating the other challenges and emitting this, right? But those at least are somewhat noticeable to the hosted parties because they create loggable files or they do other things. Where this seems like once you did this, it would be less obvious to the hosted parties, or am I wrong? It looks like
I would phrase that a little differently. I think the hosting provider can always get a certificate. If you've hosted example.com,
right,
they can pretty much always get a certificate for that without any trace. I'm imagining like the Heroku hosting platform has this complicated routing system before it ever gets to the customer, right? So they could just hook that routing system and the customer would never see anything. So I find the point about observability less compelling. I think the difference here between the standard your hosting provider can screw you argument and this is that here your hosting provider is screwing you by letting some other guy get certificates, not the hosting provider. So it's an inadvertent action by the hosting provider, not a malicious one.
So my initial reaction to to this is honestly that maybe this is a lot of hassle and we need to come up with a different solution, but that dropping the solution entirely seems problematic. Can we, instead of this proposal, removing this default protection, open an issue to replace the mechanism and see if we can come up with a simpler one?
We could. It's not totally clear to me that you can do a lot better than this, because in order to separate this default, I mean, so you need to separate somehow the case where I actually control the virtual hosts on this provider and the default vhost case. The current solution relies on requiring the
some random subset. And
in the current mechanism, with the current mechanism, in order for the attack to work, the attacker has to provide a sequence of certificates in pretty rapid succession and guess the right order that the CA is going to ask for.
Right.
Assuming that there's only one default vhost.
And the concern with continuing to use that is that the number of iterations is sort of problematic for the challenge, and that you as the appropriate responder also have to generate those in appropriate succession, and it's somewhat complicated to both get that right and check, if I understand the issue correctly.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that it does actually provide some significant protection in this case, and dropping it with no replacement, I'm not sure that you as a hosted party on one of these services would actually even know that this could happen to you.
That you could detect, right?
Okay, so then maybe text around how you could detect that this could happen.
I mean, yeah, that's true. Yeah, so you're saying you might be okay with dropping it if you explain to clients that they should check that this is
right. That there's some way of actually mitigating this risk from the point of view of the hosted party, either by pre-check that they're in that condition and they can go seek another provider, or something else. But
actually, yeah, now that I think about it, you would want the CA to do the check to see if, send just a completely random vhost value and as a probe to the hosting provider to see if something responds, to see if this particular hosting provider has this issue before accepting a TLS challenge.
All right, so that still doesn't work if the hosting provider itself is the attacker, but we agree that's probably not the bit to worry about. Okay, so I guess speaking again as a participant, not with any hats on, I'm not quite ready to just remove this. I'd like some more thinking about either text that can go in there or CA actions that can go in there to mitigate this a little bit more.
Yeah, I think now that you mentioned, I think I'm more enthusiastic about specifying a way, an action to have the CA take to check whether this threat scenario is the case. Because that you can't have the client check because the risk attaches when it's right before. Yeah, so I think what I would like to try here is to try to specify what the CA should do to check whether this is the case, to check whether the default vhost, and then take the mechanism out, not have the multiple mechanism.
It's probably an operational issue, not a protocol issue, and some non-normative text that says what to do, because it is, I agree with you, the realization that it is the CA that's at risk for incorrectly issuing. Yep. Fine.
Yeah, I'm just pondering where to put the text, probably in the challenge section, but yeah, we can figure that out. It's just text. All right, yeah, anyone have strong objections to that course of action, having the CA check for whether there's a default vhost in place before it will do a TLS-based validation? Seeing a couple nods. Okay, I'll draft some text for that. All right, good. I think we're getting close to the end here. We're good on time. Might get done early. Yeah, okay, I saved this for last. This is the last one, so we know we're clear to go. This is probably the most asked question, both on the individual repo and in a lot of the Let's Encrypt forums. Came up on the ACME mailing list. Right now, the HTTP challenge is always on port 80. The TLS challenge is always 443. And of course, there are other ports on which people run HTTP-like things and on which they run TLS-enabled things. And you might imagine that if you're the CalDAV administrator for example.com, you might want to be able to get a cert for your CalDAV server and use your CalDAV server to do the authorization to prove that you own example.com. But of course, that's kind of a double-edged sword, right? If we were letting the CalDAV administrator use CalDAV to show that he owns the domain, then the guy with the CalDAV server can prove that he owns the domain, and you might not want to authorize that in any case. And that's saying nothing of the risk of high-numbered ports and arbitrary users on a machine spinning up HTTP or TLS services. Anyone here who really wants this or has, actually, I've got a couple of proposals. Actually, on the next slide, I've got some. Yeah.
Hi, this is DKG. So I do have a use for this. And in particular, it's for certificates that have SRV IDs in their subject alt names. So subject alt names don't need to just have DNS names. They can have other name types. And the advantage of having other name types, in particular SRV ID, is that you can scope it closer than the host. So that in particular, you can deploy, for example, an IMAP cert that does not allow you to impersonate a web server. So the IMAP service doesn't impersonate a web server. In particular, I want it for the new DNS over TLS, where I would like to be able to say _domain s _tcp example.com is where example.com runs their DNS over TLS recursive resolver. And I'd like you to issue a certificate for that, but I don't want you to issue a certificate that this DNS server can use to pretend that it is https://example.com. So in that case, the port option comes from the SRV record that you check.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that use case. So I think that actually has some broader implications if you want to use those names though. So right now, ACME talks about identifiers, and it defines one type of identifier, which is a domain name. And so I think if we were going to support validation for those SRV names, you would want to have a different identifier type and different challenges to go along with it. So we would support the different challenge to validate the specific port for the SRV name and have that port adaptation there and scope to the SRV name, as opposed to updating the challenges for DNS names.
Right. No, my thought is that this would be useful for ports other than 443 for non-DNS name subject alt name, for a certificate that had a non-DNS name subject alt name. And yes, I agree that would not produce a certificate that would be useful for someone who wanted to do a DNS name validation on the certificate.
Yeah.
But I think it would be useful, and other services, we have a definition for _IMAPs._TCP. Services should be able to validate that. Clients should be able to validate that. So this is one thing, one answer you could give to people who come to you with this. If we have a Srv ID specification, is to say, sure, make sure that your stuff works with Srv names.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is, like, if you're going to make an Srv ID specification, which I think the way the extensibility points are cut out, it would be natural just to do that in a separate doc. I think what we would do if we did that is say, here's what an Srv ID looks like, and here are the challenges you do. And it may be that you define the challenges by reference. You say, do HTTP on the port specified in the Srv, or do TLS on the port specified in the SRV.
It would be TLS, because the Srvs are not necessarily used for HTTP.
Oh, sure.
Right.
Yeah, so let me maybe rescope the question here is, for the domain name validation that we have in the current doc, do we want to support alternative ports for domain name validation?
This is DKG. I actually think that is super sketchy. I think it's sketchy that we've been using domain names this whole time, because service A on host X is not the same as service B on host X. The fact that we are even issuing certs that don't scope to the service, that scope to the host, I think is sketchy. So I wouldn't want to extend that sketchiness.
Fair enough. Is there anyone else in the room here who thinks that this alternate port stuff is important to support for domain name validation? Not hearing it. It's interesting. We have lots of people interested in out on the internet, but not here.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, I'm a little concerned that we will close the issue here, and the hundreds of emails that I've seen will just continue.
Yeah,
I think we need a good answer for those people, I think.
Yeah. I was not going to consider it closed, and I was going to hopefully we could confirm it on the list.
And I see Ted.
Chairs have.
Oh, yep, this is me using the chair mic for a second. So I guess the question we really would come to here is if we have a mechanism in the draft similar to the one DKG proposed for service scoped allocations of certificates using the TLS challenge. So we would basically say, hey, if you have a service like IMAP-S or DNS over TLS, which is capable of using the TLS challenge, you may use ACME in the following way, right? We would not support creating a DNS challenge-based mechanism for other ports for the sketchiness reasons that he laid out. And that the answer to those people would be draft text that says, hey, if you want to have a different service, then here's the mechanism you have to have in place in order to get it, and explain what the sketchiness is of using the DNS-based one. That one gives in the draft a reason for not using the DNS-based one, and two, provides an alternative for any other TLS-based service which might appear in a service ID field. That there are probably a couple hundred messages that might not be satisfied by that answer, but I think it would be a reasonable way forward for saying, here's what the kind of balance between creating a secure system and meeting your needs are, right? If you have needs that don't actually create a secure system, side.
I think the thing to do might be to propose that in an email to the list and let people chime in on that thread if there's objections before we necessarily land any text.
And maybe generate a pull request, because there are a large number of people who want to participate on GitHub, and we see them only turning up there.
That's true. You think the pull request would like add some text to the security considerations?
No, we just act like flypaper, I guess.
Yeah.
So wearing my chair hat, I'm not overly happy about conducting the conversation only on GitHub.
No.
So,
my suggestion was to generate a pull request, then send an email to the list that linked to that pull request, and
cross-link them.
And explained exactly what it is that the pull request hopes to achieve, and why we think this is a good idea for the reasons that you said before.
Yeah. So the justification would be on the mailing list.
Right.
And there would be a link to that in the pull request.
Okay, so as long as the pull request also puts the link to the mailing list discussion, that's okay for the moment. But I guess I want to turn it back to the room and to ask the room if there are other people who have different thoughts of the way forward here.
Come on up, Jeff.
Hi, sorry I'm behind on this discussion, but I don't have a different thought on the way forward, but we should carefully in this process think about the implications for RFC 6125. And if you're by happenstance adding any new requirements that ought to go into that spec or that aren't already covered by that spec, got to figure out how one would address that. Is that buried in ACME documents, or could this be stuff that would get added to 6125 updated?
Yeah, I think for the most part, we're just talking about how you validate stuff that would meet the requirements of 6125 once it was in a certificate. But if there were a revision process open, it might not be a terrible idea to add some comments in there about how one goes about validating the name. Oh yeah, I know. Yeah. Do you know if it happens to? Do you happen to know if it talks about how names are validated and what the considerations are around that?
Yeah,
it does. Okay.
You mean mapping names in certs to DNS names, right?
No, I mean, 6125, that's the primary focus, is how you take a certificate and match it against a domain name that you will try to authenticate. The concern here is precedent to that, in the sense that we're talking about how a CA, before it issues a certificate, checks that it should issue a certificate with a given name.
Okay. Anyway,
Which you know, you can see how they sort of notch together.
yeah.
And so if there's not discussion of that prior step in 6125, it might be useful to have some notes on that if there's like, cause I don't know if it's,
yeah,
I don't know if that's big enough to merit, you know, opening the patient, but
yeah,
if the patient's on the table, then maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I'm willing to review.
Great.
Max Purdy-Francisco. This seems like a very small example of a broader set of cases that enter into the sketchy zone of connecting back into devices that are not in the port 80 or port 443 space. And there's a whole bunch of other examples of that use case. And so we might want to look at it more broadly.
Yeah. So this is not, you're not taking any action for generic ports with HTTP or TLS is not to say that we can never do other ports than 80 or 443. It's not taking action here would basically imply that if we want to extend validation to things that don't do those ports, we would define a new challenge to do whatever the new thing is. Right, so we got an extensible challenge space, so we can do that. I think it does make sense though to use that to do the extension in a more controlled manner. So if you wanted to extend to say IMAP-S, you could define an IMAP-S challenge if you wanted to trust the mail server to get certs from the domain. Yeah. All right. Thanks for that discussion. I think that's, so the scribes, I assume, have gotten the action to send a mailing list, a note to the mailing list. I guess I'll try and draft that text. All right. So I think that's the last issue. I had some, if people wanted to do this, I had some options for how we could, but we're not. So this is not needed. And I think that's the last issue we had. Yeah. Actually, I thought of one more as we were discussing the account recovery earlier and what you do if you've lost your account key. We've got two mechanisms in there right now. One that uses contact information. So the CA would send you an email to your registered contact address, and you know the rest of it is unspecified. But the idea is you would do the standard sort of click the link to verify that you've gotten this email and prove that this is your account. So that's the first method. We've got contact-based recovery, and then we've got another. I forget what we called it, but it uses a bunch of fancy crypto to establish a secret key that you could write down and stick in a safe or in a file cabinet or something, and then use that secret to come back and recover your account later. In talking to people, I've not seen a whole lot of interest in that latter flavor, the one where you get something you can write down and stash away. Do people think that that's important to keep in the document? I'm sort of inclined to get rid of it because it adds a fair bit of complexity and it requires some non-trivial crypto on the client and server to do Diffie-Hellman moderated over HTTP. I don't know, is there any objection in the room to ripping out the token-based recovery, crypto-based recovery? I'm not aware of any implementation of it, even in Let's Encrypt.
Channeling PHP on Jabber. Knife it.
Excellent. All right, will do. I love taking things out of specs. All right, that's all I got. Anything else, chairs?
Any other issues for the draft? Okay, then it's time for issues for the working group. I'd like you all to open your calendar application or at least your mental model of how far away our Buenos Aires meeting is. It's a long time from now, 5 months. So the interaction on the mailing list has actually been pretty sparse. And we'd really like to make sure that people understand that we do not wish to turn up in Buenos Aires with another issues list and a 02 and be silent between then and now. We really can't afford that amount of time. So as soon as these issues get merged into a new draft, we would like to have some real review of the draft, either in standard IETF fashion, fully on the mailing list, or in our split brain mechanism of issues in GitHub brought to the mailing list. But we really cannot wait between now and Buenos Aires to have this progress. We want to be moving much, much faster than that. The second point is, you heard us say it before, that do not implement is out of the draft. Implement. And we really would like people who are trying to implement this spec as part of the review community at this point. So if you are implementing a client, if you're implementing any other part of the system, please share your experiences early and often. Anything you found ambiguous, anything you found difficult to follow, we really need you to help us make sure that this is something that anybody can use as a standard. So go forth and make some Acme clients, make some Acme servers, make some Acme traffic for us to work with.
Richard Barnes, one thing I would add to that, in addition to people implementing things, folks who have experience with existing issuance APIs, things that CAs are using nowadays, I would love to know how Acme maps to your issuance API of preference. And if it's not clean, what we need to do to align it. Because it is my earnest hope that we can get Acme to a point where we can get most of the PKI moved over to it. So if there's any gaps between things that existing APIs do and things that Acme supports right now, I would love to find those out as soon as possible so that we can extend Acme to cover your use cases.
JC Jones, at the expense of being obvious, if you're building a client, Let's Encrypt runs a staging network that you can do whatever you want to. Feel free to ping me.
If you haven't sent that to the list recently, please send to the list how to participate in that staging network.
Absolutely.
Any other comments for the good of the order? Hearing none, we're done. Everybody head over to PERC and see how we're doing on making.
The full screen wouldn't do it, I think it's there. Yeah, it gives you like a 5-second timer. Yeah. So what time is it? What's that? What time is it? 20, 10:30. So what are your plans?